turn on the camera, he hops down. Say hi to the internet, buddy. Huck. Hey, Huck. Say hi, Huck, internet. Hello, internet. I'm Huckleberry. Hello. He wanted to say hi. Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, today's going to be kind of an interesting experience, because originally I was going to hop into the next chapter of Understanding Comics, which I believe is into the ideas of just inspiration, idea, and the functional role of the artist in relation to comics. But kind of thinking on that one, it also reminded me of a book that I've completed recently, and I thought, wow, this is pretty good. In fact, to be honest, the real reaction was, wow, that was like good. Why is this good? This wasn't supposed to be good. This was supposed to be just funny and just ridiculous. And then by the time I finished it, I realized, shit, it's pretty good. So, what exactly was it that made me think that? Well, before I answer that question, I should probably ask you, the viewer, just take a moment and answer me this. When was the last time you heard somebody say, "Heavens to Murgatroyd"? Yeah, probably never. The reason for that is simple, is because it's an expression made by a cartoon character from the late 1950s and early 60s. And that character's name was Snagglepuss. Which probably then some people will immediately know what I'm talking about, and they're like, oh God, you didn't. In which case, yes, oh God, I did. I was perusing books one night on my, just what have you, and I stumbled upon the fact that Snagglepuss, the Hannah-Barberra cartoon, the ultimate gay icon, honey, for that particular time period at the very least, had his own comic book. And not just like one comic book, like 6 issues bound into a trade, and more importantly, published by DC Comics. So the same company responsible for all those great Batman and Green Lantern and Wonder Woman and Superman comic books also published Snagglepuss. What is real? But that was my reaction. Now, some people might immediately still be wondering, who the flip is Snagglepuss and why should I care? To which case, then I have to provide a little bit of background material. During the late 1950s, a small production company by the title of Hannah-Barberra was launched. It was 2 brothers who, of course, their first names I can't remember off the top of my head. I'll include the Wikipedia page for them because I'll talk about that in a second. But the Hannah-Barberra brothers launched a production company, and it was predominantly cartoons centered around a lot of humanoid animals. You've probably heard the phrase, smarter than the average bear. That's Yogi Bear. That was a Hanna-Barbera cartoon. Snagglepuss was Heavens to Murgatroyd. A lot of these characters would have kind of just catchy just mottos or slang catchphrases or something. This is the same company that also produced Quick Draw McGraw, who is El Kabong. This is the same production company that also put out The Flintstones. And The Flintstones is remarkably influential because if you never watched the Simpsons Family Guy crossover that happened a couple years ago, there's a famous court scene where Simpsons accuse Family Guy of basically stealing Duff beer and turning it into Pawtucket Patriot Ale. And the gag is at the very end of the trial, the judge is deliberating, and we see the whole courtroom watching basically the Simpsons version and the Family Guy version of the same character. And then at the very end, the judge is revealed to be Fred Flintstone. This is basically a play on the fact that both Matt Groening and Seth MacFarlane pulled heavily from the Hanna-Barbera franchise. And in fact, other cartoons such as Johnny Quest, and then even such smaller cartoons like The Herculoids, were largely produced by Hanna-Barbera. The Hanna-Barbera universe or the Hanna-Barbera production company was a massive feat for animation, and we're still feeling its influence today because an entire generation of children grew up watching those cartoons. A whole generation of voiceover actors grew up listening to Snagglepuss going, "Heaven's Smurgatroyd." And for the record, I'm going to be doing that a lot more during this video, so just fair warning. Just bear with me. Whatever the case, Hanna-Barbera was massively influential. But over time, eventually, they more or less just fell by the wayside. A whole host of contributing factors can really be explained by this, and I'm not really the one to do it. If you can go online, just YouTube Hanna-Barbera, and you'll get either samples of their actual cartoons, or you'll get details of the production company and its contributions to the field of animation. Hanna-Barbera was purchased several years ago by Time Warner, aka Warner Brothers, the same company, or the parent company that puts out DC. So the reason why this comic book exists is because Hanna-Barbera is now essentially the intellectual property of Warner Brothers. And so what's happened then is that DC Comics are basically, because they're owned by the same parent company, they have the rights, and this is where you get into all the fun claptrap of licensing issues, stuff that I don't understand if you put a gun to my head. Well, if you put a gun to my head, I could probably come up with something, but it wouldn't be accurate. Anyway, because Hanna-Barbera is owned by Warner Brothers, they're sitting on a stockpile of intellectual property. And so somebody somewhere decided, hey, here's a thought. What if we basically start putting out Hanna-Barbera comics? I mean, we still publish Archie comics, so surely somebody out there somewhere is going to purchase a Snagglepuss comic book. Case in point. Now, this is actually part of a wider extended universe, because the top here, let's see, you'll observe is the Hanna-Barbera universe. This is a real and actively words, they disappear. This is still an active company, because essentially what's happening is DC is putting out comics and graphic novels in the Hanna-Barbera universe. Now, whether or not Batman and Superman live in the same universe as Snagglepuss and the Flintstones, we're not going to go down that rabbit hole. Because again, as always, the focus of this channel is looking at the medium of comics, how it works, how it operates, what are some interesting examples of notable comic books, or just comic books that I think are worth your time, and then just me geeking out about them. Because again, Snagglepuss, to be honest, was never really my favorite character growing up. I honestly preferred watching Yogi Bear, because I was one of the last members of my generation where Cartoon Network would still play Hanna-Barbera cartoons and Looney Tunes and Tom and Jerry in the early mornings before eventually moving more towards original programming. Now, you can only get access to Hanna-Barbera cartoons largely through Boomerang or streaming services. Also, Huckleberry Hound was kind of my favorite dog. Case in point, I have a dog named Huckleberry. Coincidence? I think not. But whatever the case, I'm talking about this book today because Hanna-Barbera has been a massive influence upon my life. And then there's also the content of this book, which is now going to be the next part of this video. So, just wait. Okay. So, during the 1950s, there was something known as the Red Scare II. There had previously been a Red Scare during the early 1900s, and immediately the question becomes, what is a Red Scare? What happened essentially was there was a massive fear culturally that communism or socialism was going to infect the United States and thus rob us of democracy. Kind of funny how history tends to just repeat itself over and over again. It's like nobody actually bothers to read history, and, you know, whatever. Whatever the case, people were really terrified, or at least a lot of people in power and influence were terrified because books like this were circulating among the masses and inspiring a lot of people to kind of unite and collectively bargain for more individual rights. Sometimes. Other times, a lot of people weren't really reading this and were just moving more towards unions because they didn't like their hands being ripped off and being told, too bad, so sad, you should have been born with 3 hands. Fun fact, This book, if you're interested in Marxism or communism, is really not worth your time. This was more or less a mass-produced piece by Karl Marx and Engels to kind of just get a boiled-down Spark Notes version. If you really want to know what Marx actually thought, you really need to read his Das Kapital books. They're these thick, massive tomes, but they're what Marx actually believed. Again, this is fluff. It's important to read once, but don't think that this is communism. Whatever the case, during the 1950s, there was a second Red Scare, because following World War II, a lot of soldiers were returning from war, and with the absence of power in Germany, Soviet Russia began to appear as a massive contester to United States authority, basically in the world order. But more importantly, there was a spread of communism into various countries surrounding the Soviet Union. And especially when China eventually became a communist country, people in the United States began to become more and more concerned because they saw a clear and existential threat to their way of being. Now, the Red Scare really started during the Truman administration, but it really came to a head during the presidential administration of Dwight D. Eisenhower. What does this have to do with Snagglepuss? Well, in the book Snagglepuss, Snagglepuss is essentially Tennessee Williams, or Gore Vidal, or basically some fancy-pantsy fairy dramatist who is incredibly smart, incredibly sexy, incredibly confident, and loves, and I mean loves, to be an absolute bitch. Okay, I'm going to dial it back a little bit, but just to say that in this book, Snagglepuss plays a playwright. He is a writer who is in the public eye. He's very witty. He's very charming. He's summoned before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he basically makes fools out of all of them. But then, the content of this book is his friend from childhood, Huckleberry Hound. He sounds familiar. Also a famous writer, this time a novelist, both from the state of Mississippi, come up to New York and they try to make a life for themselves because both men are secretly gay. And this ties into the Red Scare the Red Scare 2 of the late 1950s, because during that time period we had what was known as pinkos. Essentially, the government began to perceive that if homosexuals were working for the government, they could effectively be blackmailed by Soviet operatives. Because if people find out they're gay, they could lose their job. So the government fixed this problem by sniffing out every homosexual they could find and firing them. You don't think about it too much. The fact of the matter is, homosexuals and a lot of people in the artistic community began to become under a lot of social pressure. It became really important to essentially hide your sexuality, or at least get what's known as a beard, which in this instance was gay men would typically marry either lesbians and have a pseudo-marriage, or what would happen is gay men would marry women just so that they could appear to the public as being straight. It was very complicated, very messy, and there's literally whole volumes of books written about it, as this small stack and then that top shelf of books right up here can attest to. The complexity that has been the homosexual experience in the United States is its own series of lectures. What's really interesting to me about this book is it takes the character of Snagglepuss, who is largely a two-dimensional character. He was just some kind of poofy queen before people really had embraced the notion of the fairy or the effeminate gay man as part of the cultural landscape. They took that character, who was largely, again, two-dimensional, and fluffed him out so that he becomes a three-dimensional man. In this book, Snagglepuss is a writer who's regularly challenging the kind of cultural pressure to hide who he actually is, what he actually is, and why he creates. And continually, he fights back. Now, again, as always, I just need to tell you now that there are some spoilers here. I don't care about spoilers, period, but I know some people do. If you want to read this book, you might want to stop watching now. I'll wait. Okay, they're gone. What happens is Huckleberry Hound, Snagglepuss's childhood friend, comes up to New York and meets a police officer who's a horse. One of the interesting things about this particular graphic novel, and I'm going to show a small clip from it now, or a couple pages from it now, is that it's very much a Hanna-Barbera universe. You'll see humanoid lions and humanoid dogs, humanoid horses, humanoid squids, pigs, hippos, what have you, alongside human beings. Now, there's also kind of a fun, albeit sort of hysterical aspect of this as well, because they kind of, well, the phrase is Donald ducking it. And they call it that because the famous Disney character Donald Duck would always wear his sailor top, but never any pants. Well, Snagglepuss and Huckleberry Hound and Elkabong and all of them, they don't wear pants. So visually, at times this book is kind of jarring because it's kind of continually establishing the structure of this universe, but you're kind of always left going, okay. It's weird. But again, these started off as cartoons, so yeah. At any rate, Huckleberry Hound comes up to New York, tries to make a life for himself. He finds a man that he falls in love with. But then, in a later passage, Huckleberry Hound, while waiting for Snagglepuss at the famous Stonewall Inn, if you're gay or queer, or even just a human being in the United States, or any just human being period, you might have heard of the Stonewall Inn. Whatever the case, the police eventually decide to raid the Stonewall Inn, and poor Huckleberry Hound is actually caught in the sting operation. What's more tragic, however, is his lover is horse and a police officer, and in one particularly jarring scene, we see him having to endure, basically, Quick Draw McGraw's... What am I trying to say? Quick Draw has to essentially beat Huckleberry into the dirt in order to protect his image as a heterosexual police officer. Now, what happens after that is that Huckleberry Hound is publicly disgraced, his picture is put in the newspaper, and you can observe here, novelist nabbed in den of deviance. Now, again, one of the facets of this book is at times it can be very melodramatic. But at the same time, that little small clip there is fundamentally accurate to the real-life experience of a lot of queer people. The reason the Stonewall riots took place was because police would regularly harass, beat, and raid gay bars all across the United States. Whenever they didn't just arrest people. Because again, at the time, being a homosexual was not only a crime, it could potentially land you in a mental institution where you could be effectively tortured or even lobotomized. So being caught by the police was frightening. But more to the point, you would also usually get lists of names published in the newspaper. And if you got published in the newspaper, people would find out pretty quickly that you were gay. And your life was effectively over. And again, if we consider it in terms of the connection of the Red Scare, having your name, or at least an individual of renown being caught in a raid on a gay bar is effectively akin to a public death sentence. And perhaps what's most tragic about the book is that Huckleberry Hound, upon basically being publicly disgraced, ultimately hangs himself, which finally pushes Snagglepuss over the limit, and he decides to basically fight the House Un-Americans Activity Committee and stand by his right to be openly gay. To which point, his career is effectively over. Until Quick Draw McGraw comes up, apologizes, and then invites him to become part of a cartoon series that he started called the Quick Draw McGraw Hour. At first, Snagglepuss was like, "No, I'm not going to do that. Cartoons? Are you kidding?" But then by the end of the book, he realizes, the hell else have I got to do? My career is over. And so he effectively becomes a cartoon character. So first off, I wanted to address one of the most beautiful rhetorical twists of this story is you have a character who started off as a two-dimensional cartoon character becoming a three-dimensional human being, and then, basically, in order to maintain his survival, has to become a two-dimensional cartoon character. I'm geeking out far more than is reasonable or even just acceptable for a human being. But I don't care. You know what? I said from the very beginning, I am a nerd and I love it. But what do I love particularly about this book? Because, again, what does this book necessarily contribute to the medium of comics? Not that much. And to be fair, it really isn't a lot of play in this particular graphic novel. Looking at this page alone is probably an excellent example. We have Huckleberry Hound. More or less, we can see his isolation, the sadness of his life. TV dinners always automatically equal sadness, just FYI. And I'm saying that having eaten one tonight. It's just apparently something you do when you're sad. But then also in the same panel over here, we see just 4 long rectangular panels of Huckleberry Hound describing his life in Mississippi, getting married, conceiving a child, being caught having an affair with another man, and then basically effectively having his entire life destroyed when the police find out and inform his wife about it. But even if you don't know the content of the story, you can see a lot of the play here, or there isn't even a lot of play. For the most part, this book is largely composed of a lot of 4-panel pages of just long horizontal panels that are largely composed of dialogue. And that's where a lot of the strength of this book, or a lot of the energy of the book, is. The writer, Mark Russell, who does or contributes a lot of work to this Hanna-Barbera universe, he also writes the Flintstones series, which I have not read, and I think he's also connected to the Scooby-Doo series as well. Again, another book that I haven't read. But nevertheless, Mark Russell's book, or Mark Russell's writing, is really where a lot of the focus of the book is. And I'm not making pot shots at Mike Feehan here. I'm not. There's a lot of good visuals in this work. Again, sometimes you'll get an occasional scene like this where the violence or just actions will sort of assume a new level. We see how Huckleberry's head is spilling off the panel, and we can kind of just feel that punch as the onomatopoeia, the word, basically kind of the word art, do a lot of our work for us. Again, most of the material is not necessarily about kind of pushing the form, because this work isn't really trying to push the form. Another example, say, of another interesting page, I would argue, is this one. Technically, this is 4 panels, or actually 5, excuse me, but we have this panel here where a man on stage is playing Huckleberry Hound and talking about his loneliness and isolation, and then we see, technically speaking, the other 1, 2, 3, 4 panels of this page are effectively pasted on top of this. So we're watching a man deliver lines about Huckleberry Hound while also observing, say, the background production of the play, and then flashback sequences of Huckleberry Hound himself. It's an interesting visual, and it's a nice little piece that I've seen in other comics, but nevertheless, I really like that this one exists. For the most part, again, though, you can see there's not a lot of experimentation. Most of these panels are pretty big because most of the work is being done inside of them. Again, this figure here, who's a representative of the House Un-Americans Activities Committee and also a closet lesbian, so, naturally she has to be the bad guy because she's gay and super in the closet. It's kind of tropey, but at the same time, it's kind of accurate to the times. But nevertheless, again, we see the way she kind of spills off the rigidity of the panel. So moments like this can actually be really interesting to see where they're kind of absorbing or kind of just observing the trend of the form of comics. Nevertheless, Snagglepuss as a comic book really doesn't try to play or experiment too much because, again, it's one of the situations where the book sort of understands what it is. This is a book about cartoon characters that people enjoyed during the 1950s and giving them a little more personality and largely making all of them gay. So, again, where Quick Draw punches or beats Huckleberry in Stonewall Inn, we see, again, the use of Quick Draw spilling off of the page, dramatic word art, Huckleberry Hound's hat almost spilling off the page. They're nice little tricks. But again, a lot of the strength of this book is not so much in the visuals of it. It's really more in the art. Because Snagglepuss, for all of his dramatis personae, really gets a lot more about his character and, more importantly, his need to rebel and just be his own person. During his final confrontation with the House Un-American Activities Committee, he has it's actually several pages of a speech, and never you fear, I'm not going to read all of them. I'm just going to read you one or two little passages from his speech here. And he notes, the truth is, a free country needs show business. People are obsessive by nature, fanatical even. Popular culture gives our fanaticism somewhere pleasant to go. Without show business, politics steps in to fill the void, and that's when the world goes to hell. I know you're all afraid. I wish I could tell you that the threat isn't real. I wish I could tell you that everything will be all right, but I cannot. I only know that a nation must either conquer its fears or become them. There's no such thing as a free country without its subversives, radicals, and undesirables. To freeze a nation in time is to destroy it. You're right that this hearing is important, but it's not me who's on trial, it's you. That's a nice 2-page speech. And it's also kind of just further accomplished by the fact that each one of these little word bubbles is complemented well by the art. The way he says we need pop culture to escape from our world, otherwise government comes in and fills the place of entertainment. And he observes, kind of, I know you're all afraid, thus cluing into the family, which was a fundamental unit in the 1950s. Again, he talks about a nation must either conquer its fears, using the image of the capital as strength, or become them, showing this woman, who is basically effectively turning her back on everything and is more or less effectively responsible for the suicide of Huckleberry Hound. And it's an excellent arrangement of panels and words. Again, Mark Russell really does a good job of making Snagglepuss a three-dimensional character for someone who, again, for the most part, only ever said, "Heavens to Murgatroyd," or "Exit, stage left, Ethan." Again, I watched a lot of Hannah-Barberra as a kid. Sue me. Actually, don't sue me. I don't have any money. Anyway, there's another passage later on in the book where we see Snagglepuss later on in life. His career is effectively over. He's been blacklisted by Hollywood. He goes into the Stonewall to get a drink after his father has died, and he talks to the bartender. And just one small note, I just love the artistic choice to make a bartender in a gay bar a bear. Just brilliance. At any rate, Snagglepuss has one last speech, and then I think I'll pretty much be done with this one. But it's a really important one. Huck's dead and all's for nothing. But it wasn't for nothing. In the last few years, the checkerboard opened for business, so did the snake pit and Eve's. The raid didn't scare people away from the Stonewall. It provided that such places were possible. You didn't fight the system to win, SP. You fought to show it can be done. It's not a great or heavily dramatic line, but at the same time, it really gets at the heart of what this book is really trying to accomplish. Snagglepuss, as a man, as a gigantic pink lion, as a playwright, as an artist, as a citizen of the United States, believes in the functional role of art in the culture. He wants to create complex human beings and represent them on the stage, because in that way, he's able to, again, feel creatively satisfied, but also, too, he's able to explore a facet of his personality that he feels is important, and on some level, is patriotic. I would argue, in terms of comics, this is a really interesting book. Also, fun fact, I Google searched Cold War graphic novels, and I couldn't really find anything. And what I mean by that is I was able to find some collections of comics that were made in the Cold War and about the Cold War, and there's even a book about Cold War comics. But as far as I can tell, I can't really find any other graphic novels which explore the Cold War. There's probably dozens out there, and I've just missed it, but please, viewer, all three of you, whoever you are, if you can find another Cold War comic book, please mention it in the comment section below, because otherwise, the Snagglepuss comic book is our only comic book about the Cold War. Process that for a moment. Okay, history aside, this book doesn't really contribute much to the area of comics overall, because it doesn't really play too much with the form, but it does use old characters in a way that isn't nostalgia. My dogs are running around if I look distracted. it creates these characters in a new way, a way that we normally wouldn't see them before. Because again, up to this point, they were just a cute pink lion, or a blue dog that played a banjo, or a bear that was always giving park rangers a hard time while wearing a hat and tie. These are ridiculous characters. There's no way they could ever have something significant to say about civil liberties, or artistic expression, or the importance of understanding how entertainment and how art can shape humanity and give us some sort of collective breathing room. And yet this book does it. The strength of this book is its writing, its dialogue. That's where the strength of this book is. And for that reason, I think you absolutely should take the time to read Snagglepuss. It's a great read. But also at the same time, it also has a lot to say about how far we've come as a country and how much work is still left to be done for the rights of LGBTQ plus individuals. Because, again, being a pansexual guy, I never really perceived that there was ever any kind of language or characters that I could look to go, oh, yeah, that's somebody who's gay. They have a life of their own. They seem happy. It was never an option. The most I had was the fairy pink lion on a cartoon special. And true, I didn't come out into my mid-20s, but nevertheless, as soon as I did, I began to go back into the media I consumed, and I began to see little pieces here and there where you could see just these little acts of rebellion where gay people managed to sort of find their way through. And Snagglepuss may not have always intended to be gay, but there is something about the fact that he got an entire legion of young men to start going, Heavens to Murgatroyd, in a totally non-ironic fashion, and to not feel bad about it. Alright, I'll end it there. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for watching effectively half an hour about a comic book about a pink lion who writes plays and fights the House Un-American Activity community. What is life? So, yes, thank you, whoever you are, wherever you are. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. I'm going to try to find one or two videos about the Cold War, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and McCarthyism, and put them in the description section below, because if you don't know anything about that time period, it's really worth looking at. It's also terribly relevant, because it doesn't matter if we're not in a McCarthyistic age right now, little acts of integrity build over time. That feels like an excellent summation for this book. Also, as always, please like, share, and subscribe, all that jazz. It helps me know that you're watching. It helps me feel validated, and I feel compelled to continue making these. It also makes me know that you're kind of enjoying these. And hey, as always, if you've got a comment, leave in the description section below. Even if you all just type in Heavens to Murgatroyd, I will like it. I promise. Boy Scout's honor, and I am a Boy Scout. I got tenderfoot. Anyway, yes, please leave a comment. It'll help me out tremendously. Like, share, and subscribe. Suggest graphic novels that you think I'm cool. Definitely, you can probably find Snagglepuss at your local comic book shop. If you can't, they probably can order it for you, because again, it is a DC comic book. So unless this book goes out of print anytime soon, I guarantee you they can order it. Or hey, check out your local public library. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. Go read some comics.